Well, greetings, everyone.
Hi, good afternoon.
Let me get our
Good evening, Dr. Payne.
good evening. Let me get our recording function starting here. Yes, good evening and good afternoon and good morning, whatever happens to be in your part of the world.
Good evening here.
All right.
Good evening from Nigeria.
Good evening. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're in week number 8. We're moving right along, of course. I always feel this particular course just always feels like it goes extra quickly, but there's just so many different issues to address as we get through these proposals, these dissertation proposals. Let's take a minute and just pray for each other and that the Lord would watch over our time together and all of our technology. That's our prayer to you, Father, that you would, of course, watch over us and please protect us. Give us your direction, your wisdom, your health, your power, all that we need, Lord, just to do the work that you've given each one of us to do in various places of your world. We come together today, Father, asking that you would give us more wisdom for the skills that we may need as we are doing the kind of work you want us to do here at BGU. We pray, Lord, that you would just watch over our technology and let everything work well in the computers and the phone lines and the all that's necessary just to make this online conference work. We thank you so much, Father, that you are God, our King, that you, Jesus, are our Savior, and we just look to you, Lord, to cause us to do your will here in your world until that day that you either take us home or you come back and take rule of this world. We praise you, Lord, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. Now let's see. Just trying to see who's here. Looks like most of us, I know there's a few people who mentioned they were not going to be able to make it today. I don't see Dr. Henry online here yet, so hopefully she'll join us here. Remember, if you're not talking, to mute your microphone so we don't get a lot of interference noise coming through the lines. And sometimes I can do that myself here. Let's see. Okay,
I'm here, Julia, via telephone.
Hello, Julia. Good to have you on board. Let's see. All right. Yeah, looks like most everyone is here. I knew Susan was going to be gone. And okay. Well, let's just take a minute. If you've got any initial thoughts or questions you want to ask before we get into a few presentations and the work for the week. So if there's nothing pressing, I think I'll just go ahead and get started just for the sake of time, and hopefully Dr. Henry will be able to join us soon. Let me just check my email to make sure she hadn't given me an email that I missed. Let's see, let me just check here one moment. Okay, I don't see any messages from her, so hopefully she'll be with us in a bit. Well, this week we're going to continue talking about the research methodology, as we call it, in a dissertation. This is, of course, the point where you start talking about how you're going to collect your information, your data that you will need to accomplish what you're trying to do in this particular dissertation project. Let me share my screen for a moment. Let's see, I'll share that screen. Wait a second. I just kind of outlined basically the instruction sheet you actually have an instruction sheet in your in week 8, and this is kind of an outline that I just wanted us to have a document to kind of work off of just as we discuss each of these sections for this chapter. And like I say, you can jump in and ask questions as we go along. And then when Dr. Henry's able to join us, she's going to give us a presentation specifically on one of the data gathering methods, which is focus groups. She's done some good work in that area, and that's one of the areas that's often used by people at BGU as a focus group, along with personal one-on-one interaction with people. But let's think about this research methodology chapter. In the proposal, you're going to lay out what you intend to do as you think it through, and then when you get into the actual dissertation, you will write what you actually did. Okay, so you'll write in future tense when you're here in the proposal. When you write the actual dissertation report, of course, you'll write in the past tense in terms of what you've done. Okay. And so that, just try to remember that. We want you to start that research methodology chapter with an introductory paragraph. And there, you just basically need to, again, summarize, what's the purpose of your project? What is it you're trying to accomplish? And it's good to kind of restate the main research question for your reader. That's just a good reminder of what you're trying to do. And you might just talk about there too, what the kind of information you think you need in order to accomplish your purpose, in order to answer your research questions. And again, this is just a paragraph, just kind of introduces the chapter for your reader. Once you've done that, we get into the first section of the chapter 3, research methodology. And it's either, I think the template just calls it research method, or should just be called, it's really the rationale for the research method. So in a couple of paragraphs here, you mainly need to indicate, what is your research methodology? What are you going to, what type of a method are you going to use? And then also tell your reader why you think that particular method is the best suited to your particular project, in terms of your purpose, what you're trying to accomplish, what kind of data you're trying to gather. Dr. Henry last week did a presentation on quantitative and qualitative methods. And I'm going to just summarize them here, and then in the instruction document, I've given you a little more data on those particular techniques. A quantitative, we always think of a quantitative, it involves quantities, numbers, okay, is how it's traditionally talked about. A quantitative approach focuses on data that can be hopefully handled in a little more of an objective manner than possibly a qualitative study could be. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about like hypotheses, okay? A hypothesis is simply a conjecture that you develop in terms of why something is happening, what are the causes of what's going on, possible solutions. When you're talking about research, and as you've been doing some of your reading, one second, I'm getting a little more static here. Okay, I muted one more. Okay, yeah, I think I muted your telephone there, Julia. I'm not sure if you can do that from your telephone. Anyway, I'll bring you back in when you need to ask something. Anyway, we're talking about the quantitative part. Traditionally, in a quantitative approach, we say we are testing hypotheses, okay? That's one purpose of a quantitative. You know, another purpose is to predict, we call it future outcomes. We try to predict how people might function, how things might go in a particular situation based on some data that we collect. And we can also determine general trends in the way people think or believe, their perceptions, okay? You know, a quantitative research that you would all be familiar with was, you know, in your country, in your city, if you go to a poll to vote, right, you're basically involved in a quantitative research study, right? That ballot goes out to people in a particular population. They go to the voting place and they, you know, mark little boxes, make check marks, however you do, or if you have a computerized system, you make choices of candidates. And then when that election is completed, of course, the quantitative data is analyzed, often using computers, sometimes using, of course, just manual methods, counting up, you know, who got the most votes in different areas of people that were various offices. We add up that number and we come up with a winner in each of the categories that are being voted upon in that particular election. That's basically a quantitative research study, if you will. We are researching the opinions, the preferences of a particular population to determine who they feel should be their particular leaders for a particular term. So you can always think of a quantitative study as an election, okay? That's one method. You know, other kinds of quantitative studies can be done in the scientific community. When I use an example, sometimes we want to test a particular car to see how well it holds up under a crash, for example. I know of, you know, testing circumstances where they'll test the bumper of a car, for example, at different speeds. They may drive that car at 10 miles an hour and bump it into some kind of an obstacle to see what kind of damage takes place. They may then do that at 15 miles an hour and see what kind of damage takes place on the bumper. Again, they're doing experiments so that they can determine what is the strength of that bumper, for example. But it's a quantitative study because we're gathering numbers. And another characteristic that's often used in relationship to a quantitative study is that it's a repeatable experiment or a repeatable survey or whatever it is, and then you would generally tend to get the same results if you do that same experiment again, or you conduct that survey again, or whatever it happens to be. So as much as possible, we're trying to have an objective approach, okay? So that's a quantitative study. In terms of using a survey as a quantitative study, we would use what we call closed-ended questions. You know, true-false questions, multiple choice questions, the Likert scale use. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, or what do you think, or how do you agree or disagree with a particular statement? You know, those are all quantitative survey techniques that are used by researchers to gather numbers that can then be analyzed. You know, once you look at those numbers, you can say, okay, X number of people believe this about this situation, or, you know, X number of people think this situation is good, X number of people think this situation is bad. Okay, so quantitative, again, trying to have objectivity as much as possible. You don't give the participant a lot of choices. Okay, you have determined the choices for that particular participant as he or she takes your survey. So that's a quantitative approach. We use closed-ended questions. The other key word for a quantitative approach is to have a very representative sample, okay? We'll talk about sampling in a minute here, okay? But, you know, for quantitative approaches, the representative sample is very important. It's somewhat important for qualitative, but not as important, because when you do a quantitative study, the outcomes that you report, you are saying that based on my research, 80% of the people in this population agree that poverty is a problem in their neighborhood. Okay? You are stating that 80% of the people believe such and such. For you to say that with any confidence, you have to make sure that you have a large enough sample to be able to make that statement. Okay? You can't necessarily say 80% of a population believes such and such if you've only, say, talked with maybe 25 people out of a population of, say, a million. You can, and that's a qualitative approach. The qualitative approach has some different purposes. You're not necessarily saying, you know, 80% of this population believes such and such. That's not your purpose. For the qualitative approach, and let's talk about that a little more, the qualitative approach, the whole purpose there is to have a more in-depth understanding of people's perceptions regarding their particular situation. It's more subjective. Again, we maybe would use one-on-one interviews or focus groups. And the key here is open-ended questions or discussion topics. Dr. Henry, in a few minutes, will talk more about focus groups. But again, some common approaches in a qualitative approach would be one-on-one interviews, focus groups. Those are both popular techniques that are used in a qualitative approach. Again, another key phrase is that we use open-ended questions. We don't just ask yes-no questions, true-false questions, multiple-choice questions. We may ask a person in terms of, you know, what do you think about the current government in your local community? Are they doing? Do you think they're doing a fair job? Would you have some suggestions you maybe would want to give the government officials from your perspective? And so you enter into a dialogue with, say, a person on a one-on-one situation, or you may discuss that situation within a focus group where you have more people giving input, and you can hear what other people are thinking. So in a qualitative approach, again, we're looking for a little more in-depth understanding. Based on some of these kinds of techniques, we can't necessarily say 80% of the people believe such and such. We can say, based on the sample size that I used in my research, this is what I found. One of the common characteristics of a qualitative approach, say either in a focus group or in a one-on-one, is to look for what we call themes that come forth, that emerge from the conversations that you have with people. You know, I've used the example of somebody who did a study of gang activity in Seattle. You know, as they did interviewing with different gang members, they heard different concepts come forth. One person said, you know, I joined the gang because I felt I needed to feel a sense of belonging. Somebody else said, you know, I joined the gang because I didn't feel safe in my neighborhood. You know, somebody else says, you know, my family was in danger, and so I joined this gang for protection. You know, I might hear the word protection come forth, and that's a theme that I determine based on how, as I've talked to different gang members, and a theme of protection. I may hear different ones express, I had a need for belonging. So, you know, now I've come up with at least a couple possible reasons why some of these, say, especially adolescents or young adults have joined gangs in a particular area. So themes, as you're listening to people talk in a focus group or a one-on-one interview, you're listening for topics that come forth, and you'll jot those down. And then, say you've done 25 interviews, you go back and look at that data and say, okay, what kinds of themes came forth in the discussions? And as you look at those themes, you then draw some conclusions. In research language, we may say, I developed some hypotheses about this situation, this poverty situation in this neighborhood, or whatever it happens to be. And then based on those conclusions that you come up with in terms of your analysis of the themes, you can then maybe begin to design some possible starting effective transformational strategies that we'll talk about in a moment. So again, quantitative, more objective. We start out with hypotheses that we start testing. We may try to predict future outcomes. We may determine general trends about how people believe or see their situation. You use closed-ended questions, and a very representative sample is necessary. Qualitative, more subjective, providing more in-depth understanding of people's perspectives regarding their situation. We use open-ended questions in techniques such as interviews, focus groups, etc. And we analyze themes that come forth as we're involved in those. Does that give you, you have some clarity on those two approaches, quantitative and qualitative, as you keep working with those topics?
Question.
Go ahead.
It's been hard to get my head around qualitative.
Okay.
Quantitative it's almost built into the word. So I'm trying to understand why the word qualitative is used. What's in the word itself that helps get a head around it? Yeah.
I suppose, the word quantitative, quantity usually deals with, how much, numbers. Qualitative, I guess, has more of a sense of, what's the quality of life? What's the quality of what this person's life situation is all about? That's how I remember, how quality and quantitative are a little different. And I can understand a little more about the quality of a person's life, for example, as I talk with that person a little more in depth than possibly I could gain by just giving them a 10-question true-false test. I can probably, have a little more freedom of expression, allowing them to express themselves a little more. I also have the advantage, say, in a one-on-one or a focus group, I also have the advantage of observing how that person is talking, the nonverbal cues that are coming forth to me. There's more subjective work going on my part as the observer, and by the person who's participating on his or her part. They're involved a little more subjectively. I don't know if that helps. That's the way I kind of think of these two approaches: quantitative, qualitative.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Let's look at this sample for a moment. Another section of your research methodology is the sample and the sampling methods. As you've been doing reading in Merriam and Cresswell, there's two kind of major types of sampling methods. There's the random sampling, and there's a purposive sampling. Generally, in most dissertations I've looked at here, I just got a message that my internet is unstable. So we'll see. Hopefully I don't jump out on you. Anyway, random is just what it says. You try, of course, random is a bit of a misnomer too, because in order to create a random sample, it takes a fair amount of expert work to create a random sample that is truly random and truly representative of a particular population. Purposive sampling is when you purposefully go about selecting certain people to be a part of your research group. Okay, so you go about it with a little more intentionality. And there again, as you're doing that, you may try to purposefully make your sample representative. You may select people from different age groups, both men and women. You may choose, depending on what you're trying to find out, you may choose people from different economic stratas. And you may, again, this is all depends on what you're trying to determine. They may have different geographical areas, if that was helpful as you put together your sample. There is a website. Let me just bring it up here for a moment. And I put the website link in your instruction sheet this week. This is through SurveyMonkey that a lot of people have used. You can actually design whole surveys using SurveyMonkey, but they have a calculator to determine sizes of sample that would be considered representative. And this would be very important, especially if you're doing a quantitative study, like I said, where the representation. But let's just look at this for a moment. If I had, say, a population size of 1,000, okay, that's a fairly small size, but maybe it was an organization that had 1,000 people, a big organization. Okay, say my population size is 1,000. That's the total. There's two other areas here, two other criteria that are needed for this particular calculator. One is the confidence level, and one is the margin of error. And you can go through this, and they'll tell you what these mean. If I go down and find, well, I think they're down here somewhere. Well, I don't see it. Anyway, a margin of error is, now there it is right there, a percentile that tells you how much you can expect your survey results to reflect the views of the overall population. The smaller the margin of error, the closer you are to having the exact answer at a given confidence level. Okay, so it's expressed in a percentage. When you hear pollsters give information, they'll say this has a margin of error or plus or minus 5%. That means that there could be a 5% chance that this data is not completely representative of the sample that I'm looking at. Confidence level, very similar, but it's a percentage that reveals how confident you can be that the population that you selected would select an answer within a certain range. For example, a 95% confidence level means that you can be 95% certain that the results lie between X and Y numbers. Okay, well, let's look at this. I just entered a population size of 1,000. Let's say I have a margin of error, 5%. I'm going to allow for a 5% error. I want to be about 95% confident that the data I'm collecting is representative of the group. Okay, so if I have 1,000 people in this population, the calculator says I need to have 278 people participate in my research. It may be, doing surveys or whatever you're doing. It's very interesting, though. If I raise this number, let's raise it to 1 million. Now look what happened. I didn't change the confidence level or the margin of error, but now I need 385 people. It's not proportional, okay, in the way sample sizes go. With 278 people, the calculator says that I can get a fairly representative representation of the 1,000 population. With 1 million population, this calculator says I can get a fairly confident representation of the sample by using 385 people. And so again, as you enter different numbers in here, this number does not go up proportionally. It goes up in a non-proportional manner. And that's just the way the statistics work, as they use statistical prediction tables, etc. And that's what these calculations are based on. So you can use a calculator like this to get some idea of the kind of sample size you're possibly needing, especially for a quantitative. You can look at it from a qualitative point of view just to see what does a calculator say would give me a fairly representative sample of a particular population that I'm working with. So you can take a look at that website. I did put that in the instruction manual. So that's under the sample method. The next section of that chapter is going to deal with data gathering methods and analysis. Again, you'll just kind of list in your proposal. Are you looking to use some questionnaires, surveys? You can use one-on-one interviews, focus groups, 3 other issues. I think that Dr. Henry talked about these when she was talking about some research techniques. Sometimes people use these last 3. The first 3 is probably the most popular, okay? But narratives, we've said a narrative is kind of it's a type of interview process, but instead of a directed interview, I ask a person more indirectly, in maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs, or just maybe give me 10 minutes of time, tell me about your life situation. And that's about all I'm going to do in terms of directing that conversation. As a good counselor, as I'm listening, I may try to reflect back, what I hear the person tell me at different times. But a narrative is just that. It's allowing that person to give his or her story, so to speak. Case studies are kind of a focused study of let's say I'm going to use a particular organization. I'm going to do a case study on how that organization develops leadership, how they train their leaders. I may use a particular organization as my case study on how leadership can be developed within organizations. But I may use one organization as a case study, and I just analyze that particular organization as much as I can with a lot of questions, interviews, surveys, various techniques. That's a case study. That's a type of gathering data. An ethnography, kind of do the same thing, but you do it with a specific ethnic population. That's where the word ethnic in ethnography comes from. We're working with a particular ethnic population. I want to understand their worldview, how they think, all different factors. Okay, both of those are fairly involved, case studies and ethnographies. So sometimes people use them, or they'll use some partial form of those. Okay. But no matter what you do, you're going to probably use one of these first 3, even if you're doing one of the bottom 3. Okay, questionnaires, surveys, one-on-one interviews, focus groups. Those are pretty much the standard methodologies that we're using to collect data. Okay, I'm going to just finish this out, and then you can ask questions, and then we're going to kind of focus in on a focus group a little more and understand some pieces there. And from that, even from that presentation, you can generalize some of the thoughts that are used even on focus groups, I think, to even one-on-one interviews. Because a focus group is actually a type of interview, according to the literature. It's just it's an interview that's done with more than one person at the same time. Okay, where a one-on-one interview is just that. It's just interviewing with one person. There's a section on your proposal called ethical considerations. What this simply means is that when you're having research participants work with you, you need to do all you can to protect them from harm, and also to protect their confidentiality. And so you will talk in that section about how you are going to ensure confidentiality in your project. There are 2 very specific situations that are actually defined for us here in the United States by the governmental agency called the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, okay? Based on that department's standards, any school or organization that's involved in human research must meet certain standards if that research involves 2 specific kinds of situations, what they call vulnerable populations or sensitive information. Okay, and I've defined some of these in the instruction sheet a little bit for you, and you can look at those. But let me just look at my notes here for a moment as I think about ethical consideration. Okay, for example, here's some vulnerable populations. Minors under the age 18, they are considered part of a vulnerable population. Pregnant women, that's called a vulnerable situation. People with mental and or physical challenges, that's considered a vulnerable population. Socially or economically handicapped people, they are considered vulnerable populations. Prison inmates are considered a vulnerable population. If your study involved any of those categories of people, then your proposal will be required to be submitted to our Institutional Review Board, IRB, okay? And just because of the populations and the people most BGU dissertations work with, I would say probably at least 80% of our proposals are required to go to our IRB. If in doubt, you should submit the proposal anyway, and I can kind of make a determination, if that's going to need official approval from our IRB in terms of the research. So vulnerable populations, we're just talking, and minors, again, that's one of them. The other area is called sensitive information. Sensitive information deals with things like financial status, political beliefs, domestic issues, family issues that are of a personal nature. Even religious beliefs, from the definition point of view, are considered sensitive information. So if you're asking anything about a person's religious beliefs, you're going to come under the IRB review. That's why I was saying most of our BGU dissertation proposals need to go to our IRB because of the nature of the kind of research that we do. So you'll talk about that here in the ethical considerations. Finally, there's a section called the intervention strategy. I think as we've been trying to emphasize, okay, first of all, every BGU dissertation requires an intervention strategy. The research must culminate in some kind of a practical approach that begins to address the problem in some practical way. Doesn't mean you're going to solve the problem through that strategy, but you're going to start some process, okay? What we've tried to emphasize, though, is that process, that transformational interventional strategy, whatever you want to call it, it needs to develop out of the empirical research. Too often, people kind of go off and they have a great idea how they maybe would like to do an intervention strategy, but they're not really, it's not really emerging out of the empirical data. We want to make sure that you've done your homework, right? That you've done the research. Then you, with some good knowledge, can begin to develop a strategy that will be applicable to that population. Examples, asset-based community development approaches, city consultations, seminars, those are all examples of kinds of innovation strategies that people have done. And finally, that chapter is going to have evaluation methods. How will you determine the reliability and the validity of your data? You've read about the concept of triangulation. You can sometimes try to get at data from different ways. You may have a written survey. You may have a personal interview. You may have some experts who will look at your data and give you some feedback in terms of the reliability. Even developing questions. There's certain good ways to develop questions. Miriam has a couple of chapters on developing questions that you should really study, because how you ask a question can determine in great ways on the validity of the answer that you get, okay? You can unintentionally even influence a person's answer because they're thinking they're going to try to give you the answer that you're expecting. And a lot of those kinds of issues get involved when we start trying to understand the validity and the reliability of data. When you do the actual dissertation, you'll also develop an evaluation strategy for the intervention strategy that you do. Any questions on those items before we jump into focus groups specifically? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to take this one off the screen. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. If you have questions, let's get the focus group presentation before us too, and then if we have other thoughts and questions, we can kind of approach all of those together. So, Dr. Henry, are you ready with that focus group presentation?
Yes, and good day to everyone. Before I begin, has anyone ever participated in a focus group? Or are you aware of the focus group? You have any experience at all? If so, I'd like you to share. Does silence mean that nobody has had an experience, a focus group experience? Okay, so then this is a totally new experience and piece of information. Just very quickly, the focus group came out of marketing and business. That's where the whole concept of the focus group started, as people sought to get information from prospective clients, buyers, etc. Since then, the focus group has been developed and has been used, and is used across a variety of fields. For example, it is much used in academic research. It is used in market research, which is where it started. It is used in government and nonprofit studies and in community development. So the focus group has become a staple in terms of research across these various institutions and organizations. What we have currently here at BGU, I've developed a 1-credit course on the focus group, and it has been developed within the PhD program. But once that program has been launched, then any student who is doing research would be able to access that class, because there is so much more to the process and how you do a focus group. So today's presentation is introductory, but it looks at the basics of what is expected of you when you propose to use the focus group as one means of collecting data for your study. Let's see. Okay. The focus group, what is it? Let me, I'm sorry. This is not what I meant to do. Okay. Oh no. Just let me move this back to where I want it. Okay. Okay. What is a focus group? It is a carefully planned discussion to obtain the perceptions of a defined interest area. I'm currently supervising the work of a student who is looking at adolescent pregnancy in his country. And one of the ways in which he's collected data was through focus groups. So the narrowly defined interest is getting to hear people's views on adolescent pregnancy, their views and their perceptions. Where is a focus group held? It's usually held in a place that is non-threatening, that people would feel comfortable attending. So the place is important when you plan to use a focus group. People must be able to go to that place without feeling any sense of threat, discomfort, etc. The focus group usually is comprised of 7 to 10 people. It is recommended that you shouldn't try to use more than 10 people in the focus group. And there are common characteristics relating to the discussion topic. The focus group has to be conducted by a trained interviewer, also called a moderator or a facilitator. And it is recommended that for you to do a research study that is significant and acceptable, you should have a minimum of 3 focus groups. So I just want you to bear that in mind. Now, in terms of the trained interviewer, moderator, facilitator, that person is going to be you, the person who's conducting the research. And what you would want to be able to do is to access information about what it means to conduct a focus group, because you have to go into it with sufficient knowledge to be the moderator. Then in turn, you may train other people to do what you're doing. And we're going to talk about that as we move forward. Why do a focus group? The focus group is one of the staples in terms of collecting qualitative data. And we also do a focus group to determine feelings, perceptions, and how people think about certain products, certain services, certain programs or opportunities. The focus group looks at attitudes and perceptions, how these are developed in part by interaction with other people. It is also used to promote self-disclosure among participants. And from the field of business, where the focus group started, we are reminded that it's important. Most businesses, before they put out a product, they do a focus group study because they want to get a sense of how people are going to respond to the product that they're putting out in the market. And so as a note to people in the field of business, doing the focus group, one of the motivations for doing the focus group within the field of business is that you do not want to take your customers for granted. So you want to get feedback from your customers. When do you conduct focus groups? Before a program begins, during a program, or after a program ends? Now, in our context, we're doing it a little differently because the focus group is the method that you're going to use to get information in terms of the particular study. So you are using it definitely for the purpose of doing research. Focus groups are effective when people have something to share, when the goal is to understand human behavior. Focus groups are not effective when people are divided or angry within a group, because the goal is not to not obtain objective insight, or it is not effective when an organization is using the focus group to improve its image. I don't think in terms of the research that you are looking at, I don't think any of those, well, maybe number 1 may apply in some instances, but number 2 and number 3 may not apply. But just to tell you when the focus group is not recommended or effective. How do you select participants for focus group? One of the goals of the focus group is to get together people of like minds. So the participants are similar, and there are some general selection rules. Set exact specification as to who you want to talk to. Maintain control of the selection process. Use the resources of, if you're doing the focus group under the umbrella of an organization, then you use the resources of the sponsoring organization in recruiting. Because your focus group, the primary objective is to do your particular research, that point may not apply unless you're doing your research within a specific organization. I'm thinking of Simon's research. I think Simon's research may apply here because he's working in the context of, or he proposes to work in the context of a particular Bible school. When you're selecting participants for the focus group, you have to beware of bias. And what you want to do is start with a pool of eligible participants and then randomly, and that word is not used as it is in statistics, but then randomly select the participants out of your pool. I will stop. If you have any questions, you may stop me, or at the end you may ask questions for clarification, etc. One of the things that people do when they have a focus group is they may have an incentive for the participants. And if you have an incentive, you don't necessarily want to announce that before the focus group. But at the end of the focus group, you may present your incentive. In most focus groups, people have snacks, food or snacks, so that people get comfortable. One of the best ways to get people comfortable in a group setting is when you have food or snacks. But in addition to that, you may have gifts or gift cards. You may use a positive, upbeat invitation, or you may even have money as a reward. But I would advise that you don't put that out ahead of the focus group, that you surprise the respondents with some kind of reward. The student whose work I'm supervising, I found it very interesting what he did, because he was working in a country where people have to travel long distances and they don't necessarily have, well, it costs them to go to the focus group. At the end of the focus group, he gave people bus fares or transportation money for them to return home, and they were pleasantly surprised. I think that was a smart move. He didn't discuss that with me when he planned his research, but I think that was very smart and sensitive. But just to illustrate the different means by which you may use incentives for your participants. The systematic notification procedures of a focus group. You have to set clear meeting times, because when you invite people to participate in the focus group, you have to be able to give them a date, a time, and a place where they would be meeting. So you have to have that clarity. And then one of the things you do is that you have a personalized invitation to people for them to participate, so they feel a sense of that you have a need to meet them and that you're showing them respect, etc. You should begin, again, depending on your context, but across the world there's so much phone contact, that the first place you may begin to make contact is by phone. So you invite people, and then you say to them that there would be a follow-up written invitation. That may be one approach that you may use. The moderator skills. Now, you want to pay attention to this. You want to pay attention to everything, but definitely to pay attention to this, because you are going to be the moderator of the focus groups that you are going to have. And remember, it is recommended that in a good study, you want to have at least 3 focus groups, okay? The moderator skills. The moderator has to be mentally and organizationally prepared. The moderator is responsible for selecting the appropriate location. The moderator is responsible for recording the discussion. You may give that responsibility to somebody else, a person named the note taker, that we're going to talk about later. But you are responsible for all of these things. You are the one who would use the small talk, the icebreaker, to welcome the participants, has a smooth and snappy introduction, uses pauses and probes, uses subtle group control techniques, controls the reactions to participants. And what that means is that as a moderator, you have to be neutral. You're not going to take sides in the discussion. You're not going to show either agreement or disagreement. So you have to be able to keep a blank face. And you have to be aware of your body language, because we may not say anything, but sometimes our body language, not sometimes, body language speaks for itself. And it is good if you use an assistant moderator and you use an appropriate conclusion or wrap-up comments. One of the things I'd invite you to do is you can go to YouTube and see examples of focus group on YouTube, so you get a sense of how it is done. The focus group, the moderator, the planner, pays careful attention to seating arrangements. You want the participants to be as comfortable as possible, and you want the setting to be informal. How do you begin a focus group discussion? Of course, the first few moments in any kind of group setting are very important, because people can be turned off or they can be made to feel welcome and to participate. So that's critical. Create a thoughtful, permissive atmosphere. Provide the ground rules. As moderator, you set the tone for the focus group. Okay, did I hear a question, Kunle? Okay, the recommended introduction pattern: have a welcome, have an overview and the topic, set the ground rules, and then ask the first question. You want to ask questions that would yield powerful information. So it is recommended that you use open-ended questions and you avoid dichotomous questions. You avoid questions that can be answered by yes, no, because that's the end of the conversation. You want a flow of information. So that is why you use open-ended questions, and you may have follow-up questions as participants respond. You may ask them to clarify or explain what they're saying. Why is rarely used in a focus group discussion, but you use what we call think back questions. And what is important is that your questions must be carefully prepared. So prior to going into the focus group, you prepare your questions, and your supervisor will work with you in terms of vetting those questions to make sure that you're using the appropriate questions and you're using questions that will elicit good feedback. And by good feedback, I'm not saying, I don't mean feedback that you will agree with, but people will be responding out of their own interest and from their heart, as it were. They're not giving you the answers that you're looking for, but they're flowing with their responses. Another thing that you may do is to consider using standardized questions for your focus group. But even there, you need to be supervised on how you do that. Because for me, what is very important is the context in which you are doing the focus group. So the questions must not seem strange to the participants. They must want to answer those questions. At the end of the focus group, you want to be able to take the responses and make meaning of what has been shared. So it is recommended that in the process of the focus group, you are starting to do some kind of analysis. Now, one of the things you do with in a focus group is you record the responses, and you have somebody who is responsible for recording those responses. But as soon after the focus group, you want to look at the data. You want to analyze the data, and you want to start to prepare the report. Now, the recording, you use the recording to go back to the recording to make sure that the notes that you're taking are accurate and accurately reflect the discussion in the group. What are some tips that you need to follow as you analyze the focus group data? You look at words, you look at the context, you look for what we call internal consistency, you look at frequency or extensiveness of comments, intensity of comments, specificity of responses, and then you want to find the big idea. So the analysis is very careful and very demanding in terms of getting together the data from the focus group. You need to have a communication strategy in terms of how you're going to analyze the data, use an appropriate reporting style that people will find helpful, strive for enlightenment, make points that are memorable, use narrative or bulleted format, and give thought to the written and oral report. So having had the people participate in the focus group, the challenge for you as moderator is to be able to assemble the responses in a meaningful way. Okay, that brings us to the end of this one. I do have another presentation, but I don't think we have time for that. Second one, it's the same thing, but this of the two, I felt this one was a better one, so I've shared this with you. Questions, comments on the focus group?
Let me make a few more comments here, Dr. Henry, if I can.
Sure.
One thing that struck me too, we encourage recording the session. You do, again, need to get written permission from all your participants just to make sure that you don't get sued or something along those lines. I think that's an important issue.
Oh, yes.
Up front, I think Dr. Henry had mentioned the idea of kind of setting the ground rules. A few of the ground rules that I find very important when I'm working with any kind of groups is assuring people of confidentiality.
Yes.
That the things that are said in this group remain here. If you can even make the point that you will be analyzing issues, but that you would be putting data in such a way that it is not easily recognizable by people who may look at this dissertation, etc. So confidentiality. I also try to emphasize the fact that in this group, we want to be very respectful of each other. It's very easy when especially we can get very heated about issues, that we want to talk with respect. And as much as possible, I try to encourage people to keep their voices at a lower tone. Don't get so emotional that you start to begin to lose control. So those were a couple of issues that kind of come to my mind, just in terms of, as I've led quite a few different kinds of groups. Another important issue too is when you're working with any kind of a group situation, of course you have those people who very easily talk, they're more extroverted. You've got people who are a little more introverted. So as a moderator, it's part of your job to subtly help have people who are talking too much to kind of, I often find it helpful to kind of summarize what they've said and then say, okay, I'd like to hear from someone else. And if someone just totally is having a hard time, I sometimes may say, well, we've heard from a lot of people. John, I haven't heard from you yet, but what I'm really interested in what you might want to have to say about this topic. So just kind of share a few thoughts. So it's just having some of those subtle ways to control a group and yet not control it so in a very outward way that it looks like you're just kind of dictating the whole issue. One more comment. A lot of the issues that I think came forth in the presentation that Dr. Henry gave are also applicable to one-on-one interviews. So I think you can even look at just the way that you set the tone, set the ground rules, help people respond, keeping on theme, looking for the words, topics, the context, the way people express their thoughts. All those are very helpful kinds of guidelines, I think, as you're looking at one-on-one interviews as well as focus groups. So,
okay, let me just thank you, Dr. Payne, for raising those issues. Let me just also say that in terms of recording, well, you have as Dr. Payne reminded us, you have to get permission. You have to let people give you permission for to do the recording. In fact, in the invitation that you will send out, you should state that, and then of course have a statement on confidentiality within that invitation, so that you have that documented that people were promised, and of course you have to keep your promise. So in assembling the responses, you do not use names, you use numbers. And one of the recommendations that is made is that in terms of the seating, remember it's a small group, 7 to 10 people, you could just put numbers on the seats. The note taker is responsible for getting a diagram of the seating, and you put numbers. Now, you may match the numbers with the names, but you're not putting names out there. So that when you report the data, you're not reporting the data as names, participant number 1, participant number 2, participant number 3. That's how you do it, right? That's very important.
Right, and I've sometimes just used a name tag with a big number and then the person's first name. The group people can, of course, address each other by first names, but that number there, especially for the person who's taking notes, can use that number as their identifier.
Okay, let me see if I could pull up but I know some people may need to go, or I think I could put a second one in today, the course too, so that you get a sense of of what is involved in terms of the focus group. Now, what is important in chapter 3 is if you're going to be using the focus group, you need to give us some basic information about the focus group that you're intending to use. For example, how many focus groups you're going to be having, and what are the topics around which you are doing this focus groups. That needs to be reported on in terms of your method, and also the selection process. You need to be able to describe how you're going to select the participants for the focus group, and then you need to show us in the appendix the letter of invitation that you will use to invite participants to attend the focus group. So those details need to be put into chapter 3 under the method of the study. Okay? Now, in terms of the interview, the one-on-one interview, which has some of the characteristics of the focus group. But the thing about the one-on-one interview, that is intense because you have to do each interview, whereas you would have 7 to 10 people in a focus group. It would mean that you would have to do interviews with 7 to 10 persons. And if you multiply that with 3 by 3, you're talking at least 21 people, at most 30 people, 30 interviews that you are going to do it. You can't give out the responsibility to the interview to somebody else. You have to be doing that. So that's intense. However, depending on the study that you're doing, for the student that I'm working with, he made the decision, which is a good decision, to do one-on-one interviews with individuals who, for whatever reason, felt threatened to respond in a group setting, but they were willing to respond on a one-on-one setting. So in addition to the focus group interviews, he did personal interviews with individuals. That, of course, is intense and demands a lot from you as the researcher, but I'm just showing you, what is involved in the process. And so when you're doing qualitative studies, I usually say to people, and I may be biased, but qualitative studies are way more demanding than a quantitative study. Because with a quantitative study, once you've identified your instrument, and when you're doing a quantitative study, you do not design your own instrument. You use an instrument that is already in the field, because there is a skill set to designing research instruments that you do not have. Usually there's a whole course that you need to take to give you the skill set to designing a research instrument. So when you do a quantitative study, you're going to use instruments that are already recognized and in the field out there. So that is already there for you to use, right? Whereas with the qualitative study, the focus group, you are responsible for designing your questions. You may use questions that are out there, but even then, you have to modify the questions to suit the group that you are working with. Okay? Any questions, comments? I know this is a lot of new information that you have to process, but any questions or comments?
Did I hear that you need a recorder? Someone who records?
If you're going to, yes, with a focus group.
So we can't do both. We can't ask the question at the same time. One person, like the researcher.
That is why you're going to have a note taker, and that person is discreetly away from you, who is going to be responsible for managing the recording equipment and also taking notes.
It's required.
Yes, of course it is, because you have to be able to go back to that, to use that when you're assembling your data. So you're not going to keep all that information in your head. You have to document. Notes will be transcribed and from the recording, but you also will take notes as you listen. But that responsibility is given to a note taker whom you will train in terms of what you want to do.
Okay.
Dr. Henry, along those same lines, you talked about showing the location of the group, like the people in the room. Can a picture be taken just to document that quickly, or does it have to
What
be a
is
sketch?
required is that you have a diagram.
Okay,
You don't take a picture, you have a diagram.
okay,
Now, I would say if you want to take a picture again, permission.
okay.
Because you know a picture is a record of
Yeah,
people's faces, etc.
exactly.
So I highly recommend that you use a diagram.
Okay,
Okay?
thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. Anybody else?
Dr. Henry, good afternoon. In my case, just one of the possible research questions I have would be to measure the perception of people regarding a particular application in the community, collaborative governance sort of approach.
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing that, for want of a sample of persons I use from across the community would have to be in some way representative of the community, I'm guessing, even as I do the focus group. It's just one of the considerations.
That is not necessarily a factor
Okay.
in the focus group. Now, what you're going to report, of course, the who of the persons who took part, but you're not going to be required to say that this group was a representative sample.
Okay.
Now, if you want to make sure, you can go ahead. It would be to your advantage. It's always to your advantage if you use what you're using is a representative sample. So if you can do that, that is excellent.
Okay.
Let me make one more comment on that regard.
Thank you.
I think if we go back and think about the way both a quantitative and a qualitative approach are used, I think as Dr. Henry said, the advantage of a quantitative approach is that you can use standardized instruments. You don't have to spend as much time trying to develop your own questionnaires, that type of thing. But the challenge, of course, of the quantitative is a quantitative requires a representative sample, because that's just the nature of a quantitative study.
Mm-hmm.
A qualitative study doesn't necessarily, you want to have as much of a representative sample as possible, but it's not a qualifying characteristic of a qualitative study. So you've got that as the advantage of a qualitative. It's easier in the sense that you don't have to come up with quite as large a sample, but you then have the challenge of designing much of your own material. As Dr. Henry said, you can look on the internet and the places to find samples of questions for focus groups, for interviews, survey questions. Miriam presents a lot of that in the last couple of chapters in that book. So you've got advantages and disadvantages, or let's not use those terms, but you have challenges to each of the approaches as you're determining, which one of those qualitative or quantitative approaches you want to use. And a mix, we didn't talk about the mix, but sometimes people will use a mixed approach. Say you want to do say you're in an organization and you want to get a quick idea of what people think in a particular organization, you put out a quantitative survey, closed-ended questions. Then you may want to follow up that survey, that quantitative survey, with, say, a qualitative focus group with a group of people who participated in your quantitative survey. So yeah, you can mix methods too are often helpful. And Cresswell talks quite a bit about following a quantitative approach with a qualitative approach, and he will talk a lot about how that works into a mixed approach.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Henry.
You're welcome.
Any other quick questions we can answer before we move out of our session today? Okay. This week, Dr. Henry will be involved in a discussion group more, and I'll be looking at your first attempt at the methodology part of your proposal. So be working on those issues this week. Again, always available by email if you have questions or issues you need to ask, and you can email either one of us. So let's close the session there. Again, appreciate your time and making the effort to be with us, and just carry on in the research class. And just thank you for all of your work that you're doing. All right, with that, we will close the session. Bye now.
Okay, have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.